Tell me if this sounds familiar. You feel tired. You've a project to finish or a deadline to hit, and you can't wait for the weekend. Except the weekend is packed too, with chores and, oh my god, you agreed to go to coffee with that friend, and then you booked a class at the gym, and well, the sun is setting before you leave the office in the evenings now, and you're drained before you even gotten home. So you managed to book a few days off. No plans, just glorious free time to rest and relax. But as you lie in bed on those days off, you feel a little anxious. There's something restless in your chest, like you should be doing something. Why do you feel guilty, almost, for doing nothing? And you're still tired. In fact, you're more tired than you realised. Like you've been running on a hamster wheel so fast that you didn't even realise until you tried to step off. You were going to chill out on these days off, read a book, maybe do some art. God, you used to love to paint, but you can't even really concentrate on watching TV. And then, like a flash, it's over, and you're back at work feeling just as exhausted as when you left. Today, we're going to be talking about rest, our struggle to truly find it, and the powerful forces that benefit from keeping us exhausted. Part 1. What even is rest? Rest, it turns out, is actually kind of hard to pin down. All of us understand what it means to some degree, but defining it in some universal way it's actually harder than you might expect. Is it the opposite of tiredness? Or is it an action to be taken? Or is it a state of being that we can reach? When you begin to research rest, there seems to be one overwhelmingly present model, the 7 types of rest it's called. It fills Google results, it's like the top topic of countless psychology blog posts, and seems to be this kind of universally accepted idea within psychology. It explains that rest, real, meaningful rest, it isn't just doing nothing, but is instead a diverse and complex web of 7 areas of life. Physical rest, whether passive like sleeping or active like stretching. Mental rest, like mindfulness, slowing down and resting your mind. Sensory rest, reducing sensory input and overload or avoiding under and overstimulation. Creative rest, finding passion in making, doing and thinking creatively and reawakening a sense of possibility. Emotional rest, like expressing yourself and your feelings. Social rest, which is like stepping away from people or relationships or groups that drain you, or spending time with rejuvenating friends or family, or even taking alone time. And finally, spiritual rest, finding purpose and belonging, connection, meditation, prayer, community. But despite how widespread this concept is, the ideas are more recent than we might think. The brainchild of Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith, who I was lucky enough to interview for this video.
My background's in internal medicine, but unfortunately, even if you know a lot about a topic, especially with healthcare, they taught us a lot about actual taking care of patients, but they didn't really teach us how to be sustainable in the profession, how to care for yourself so you don't burn out. So I burned out was how I initially started my rest journey. And so that journey took me into looking at what is it we know about rest and what is it we're not discussing. We know a lot about the need for sleep, but nobody is really telling us how to rest. Rest and sleep were just being kind of lumped over into the same bucket. There were so many other areas where I saw that I was losing energy. And if you're losing energy in a place, then it can become depleted. And a term that I tend to use is have a rest deficit. And that's what we're feeling. And so for a lot of us, when we say we're tired, we aren't quantifying exactly what kind of tired it is. It's like, I'm tired, but what kind of tired is it? Is it physical, mental, spiritual? Which of the 7 is it?
A few years ago, the Wellcome Collection in London hosted a years-long project on rest and restlessness, which included the Rest Test Survey. More than 18,000 people from 134 countries attempted the survey, making this the world's largest ever survey on rest. They gave participants a list of restful activities and had them rank them. This is the resulting average list from most to least relaxing of all of the different tasks they were given. But these are averages, not one universal list that fits everyone. In fact, spending time on my own and being in or looking at a natural environment were both ranked highly. Spending time with friends and family and chatting and socializing came further down. When we say we need more rest, is it more that we yearn for time away from other people? More women than men selected reading as restful, while more men selected listening to music. Notice that physical activity comes higher than chatting or drinking socially. A substantial minority considers physical exercise not to be the opposite of rest, but to be restful in itself. Okay, so rest is deeply personal and changeable. One of these 7 types of rest might be key for you, but ultimately restless to your best friend even. And outside of the theory of the 7 types of rest, there are other ideas about what exactly rest is, although I will say these aren't in contradiction to Dalton Smith's ideas. Non-sleep deep rest, or NSDR, is a term coined by Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist and professor at the Stanford School of Medicine, which describes the practice of relaxation techniques which use the body to affect the mind. Rather than trying to think your way into feeling relaxed, you lean into a state of physical relaxation that your nervous system then matches, which is itself based on a much older tradition of yoga nidra. A similar study of ancient practices and meditation led to the study of the relaxation response by Dr. Herbert Benson in the mid-20th century, which described a natural innate protective mechanism which allows us to turn off harmful effects from stress through changes that decrease heart rate, lower metabolism, decrease rate of breathing, and in this way bring the body back into a healthier balance. This is essentially what we mean when we say rest, right? An internal feeling that is about both our body and our mind. Rest is paradoxically an action. It's a thing you do, but it's also an intended result, to feel rested. And this is where it gets messy, because as we all know, intentions are not always the same as results. Many of us try to rest, have picked out a restful activity from the list, maybe even combine some of the 7 types of rest together, and yet we don't end up feeling the supposed benefits. If rest, as Dr. Benson suggests, is a natural state of being, why is it so damn hard? When we gave people a list of words and asked which word best described what rest meant to them, the most commonly cited word was relaxing, followed by peaceful, calming, comfortable, recuperative, and sleep. A small proportion of people chose the words rare, stress-inducing, anxiety-inducing, and guilt-inducing. Significantly more women than men did this. And this, I suppose, is the heart of it. Comfortable, relaxing, peaceful, all things rest is supposed to be. Yet the exact opposite is also present for many people: guilt, stress, and anxiety. Something about rest doesn't feel natural to us anymore, if it ever did. And that is a big problem. Part 2. Why can't we rest? I just spent 3 weeks in Berlin as a creative in residence. 3 weeks where I got to stay in a lovely flat, take time off from YouTube work, and create. Before I arrived, I anticipated jamming my days full to the brim with creative work. That, after all, is what making the most of an opportunity looks like, right? This artistic treadmill of thinking and writing and, importantly, producing. I felt like I needed to have something significant and finished by the end of my time there. Now, I'd taken off time from YouTube before, and I knew how it always goes for me. Even when I'm meant to be resting, I think of something that needs to be done in the future or something I could be doing right now. A part of me feels like every moment of rest and that tiny bit of energy that I get from that rest should be used immediately in case I lose that spark. I asked a friend to hop on a call with me while I was in Berlin to try and figure out, ways to be productive when I was there, strategies to success, how to work out clear goals for my time. And then I had dinner with the woman who runs the residency, and I really earnestly told her, I talked to a friend today about my goals for the trip. And she turns to me and says, well, I hope you said nothing. I hope you have no goals. I hope you know your only obligation is exploration and play and rest. The way that moment rewired my brain chemistry in many ways, the freedom that gave me was like a thunderclap. Yet, it still wasn't easy to actually do, even with that sort of permission. Even as I was literally seeing the way that rest was helping my creativity and exploration levels, I still felt like I needed to earn that enjoyment. The mindset encouraged by capitalism enforces the idea that productivity is key, that your worth, both in terms of monetary output, but also just like as a person, work hybrid kind of creature, is in how much you can produce, your speed, your efficiency, your contributions. I read a bunch of books about rest for this video, and so many of them, once you peel back even the surface layer, they weren't about rest at all. They were about productivity too. Rest was just a way of accessing and streamlining productivity. Productivity was the only way rest could be justified. Okay, this isn't in the script, and I can't believe I'm about to get so meta here. It's been, 5 minutes of this video so far, and I've already mentioned capitalism. I know it's a Rowan Ellis video, but that's pretty soon. A lot of big concepts. There's been citations, quotations, stats. Not necessarily very restful for you in the last 5 minutes, or for me. So I'm going to take 2 seconds to just pause, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders. Let me introduce you to the gang. This is PT, short for PTSD. He's had a hard life. He was found in a charity bin. He's a Hamleys bear. my sweet boy. This is Pear. This is my friend Tasman's little dragon. This bear, I'm now realising, who is in my lap, don't actually know his name. It's my friend Jess's bear. We'll put the name here. Just thought it seemed rude. They're hanging out with me here, you don't know them. Just thought we'd take a second before we dive back into just the existential dread that is a lack of rest in your life and maybe all of our lives. Don't worry, at the end of the video we're going to talk about what we can do about it. But deep breath, let's dive back in. Okay. So I think many of us are familiar with this kind of productivity mindset in our work lives. When I think about the jobs I've had over the years, every one of them pounded this ethos into us. When I worked at the checkouts at Tesco, we had a program within the scanning system that calculated the average scanning speed and rest time between shoppers. And if we weren't fast enough or serving enough customers per shift, that was a negative reflection on us. When I worked in social media for different companies, assessments of my work were all about KPIs, measurable statistics, the number of posts that I could produce, as well as their success. As a freelancer, I have the ever-present worry about losing work and therefore income without a guarantee of more coming in. Pushing myself to be as productive as possible is a side effect of knowing that income from work now might have to cover me in the future. It's necessary for my long-term survival. And when you can technically work any day at any time, as a freelancer, rest can feel like a wasted opportunity. Because here's the thing, the workplace isn't where this ends. Our internalized capitalist ideas around work create a belief framework that extends to every part of our lives, until we start to think about food, friendships, even our time alone with our own thoughts through this same lens of productivity. There's evidence we think about others this way too. One workplace study from Columbia Business School asked people to assess fake Facebook posts written by a fictional woman called Sally Fisher. One version of Sally said things like, enjoying a long lunch break, and at 5 p.m. on a Friday she posted, done with work. In the other version, the busy Sally Fisher posted, quick 10-minute lunch, and at 5 p.m. on Friday she posted, still working. People were asked to assess her social status. You'll not be surprised to learn that they rated the busy Sally as higher in status, more in demand, and put her on a top rung of a pictorial ladder of economic wealth. If she's too busy to stop for a proper lunch, they reasoned, she must be important. Lazy Sally languished low on the ladder. This assessment of her attitude to work reflected not just on her work itself and income status, but on her social status more widely. This pervasive work ethic has a long history, existing actually before the advent of capitalism, but was still fueled and based in fear and inequality in many ways. Take the Puritan-based idea that work improved one's moral character, an idea perfectly suited as a persuasive technique encouraging the working classes to toil for the sake of their own souls. Work was not just to grow and harvest the food that could feed the town, or weaving the fabric that would create clothes to keep out the cold. It was a moral and religious pursuit all on its own. And historically, this wasn't just a philosophical theory used on paid workers. This form of Christianity taught that suffering was morally righteous, and that slaves would be rewarded in heaven for being docile, agreeable, and most important, diligent. Diligence, productivity, hard work, all wrapped up into a package of moral virtue that could be unloaded like a weapon to punish those that went against it. The idle, lazy, apathetic people, the morally corrupt. The purpose of work became the work itself, not because it was necessarily fulfilling, but to justify work as a natural part of human life. That separation between the purpose of work and the product of that work has been the focus of many subsequent economic theories. Once you get to a level or type of production that moves beyond the materially useful, like food or clothing, and into the type of busy work that only serves to make further profit for corporate elites, you need something more to encourage workers to continue that work. Framing hard work itself as a sign of moral goodness is the foundation of a capitalist world where the product of many people's work doesn't seem to do much material good for anyone. You need a work ethic that persuades people to continue to work anyway. Many of us live in affluent countries with boundless technology that could alleviate the need to work at all. And yet many of us struggle still with finding a real restful sense of relaxation and leisure. Whether the work ethic is continued as an internal judge affecting our work is immaterial, so long as the ethic remains a driving force of workplaces themselves. We can remove the self-flagellance of guilt, but so long as the threat of socio-professional disapproval or dismissal remains, so does the work ethic as king, or in the space of the workplace, boss. Once we understand rest as a political concept, we can start to see how easily it overlaps with issues of social justice and inequality. There's the obvious economic inequality with rest. Despite what a lot of rich people seem to think, making more money doesn't automatically mean that you've worked harder. In fact, a lot of truly grueling and thankless jobs are terribly paid. The rise of freelancing and the gig economy has led to a workforce of people without reliable access to employee perks like retirement plans, healthcare, overtime, or even weekends. Many jobs within this gig economy require constant availability if you want to have a reasonable income. One article from The Guardian in 2020 interviewed gig workers about their schedules. One handyman telling the journalist, "If you want to get the money, you've got to be available 7 days a week." I feel like at this point, everyone on this corner of the internet understands that it's expensive to be poor, right? You can't buy the expensive thing outright, so you buy the cheap thing that will break and you have to buy it again and again until you've spent more money than you would have on the expensive thing in the first place. Rents are often higher than mortgage payments, but a lack of savings for a down payment prohibits that option. It's a restless back and forth. More time spent working to earn less money to pay to replace cheaper clothes or tools that break quicker. As famous Tumblr user John Green put it in a recent video, poverty is expensive because it costs so much time and money to navigate systems that are built to exclude the poor. For example, consider 2 college students. Let's actually get you involved in this. This one pair, family is financially well off, is able to support them. But PT's family, low income, isn't able to contribute to his studies or housing financially. The richer student can simply pay tuition and living costs through gifts from their family. The poorer student needs to research scholarships, financial aid and student loans, fill out applications, and if accepted, fill out even more paperwork. In addition to spending potentially more money on their education in the long run due to interest rates, the poor student will also spend more time than the rich student on paying that money. In Isabel Moncloa's essay, A Hidden Currency of Incalculable Worth, he writes, "Poverty is the great thief of time, robbing parents of hours spent with their children. It takes them away from sporting events, choir concerts, ballet recitals, afternoon homework, and watching Saturday morning cartoons, snuggled on the couch in pajamas. It may seem unconventional to describe a lack of seconds, minutes, and hours as a form of destitution, but poverty is a scarcity that extends to every aspect of life." That essay focuses mainly on the importance of having time with your children, but I think its conclusion applies to child-free people as well. Living wage should be one in which there is space for something beyond work. If rest is available in the space between work, it's inevitably ever out of reach for those whose work includes not just a singular job, but potentially multiple jobs, alongside these extra steps, in addition to things like extended commuting time on cheaper public transit routes. The acceptance of these disparities have a long history. The social upheaval of the Industrial Revolution needed to frame hard, often backbreaking work as vital to humanity. Propaganda from that time often claimed that if the working poor weren't kept busy, they would resort to crime and drug use, and society would run amok. Laziness had officially become not only a personal failing, but a social ill to be defeated, and it has remained that way ever since. This social imbalance of rest goes beyond class and income. Gender, for example, has to be considered when we look at the distribution of housework, where on average women tend to do more housework even if they already work the same hours as their male partner. A 2022 study found that women have 30% less free time than men, with married heterosexual child-free women spending 2.4 times as much time as their male counterparts on household work. And of course, there's the ways that disability intersects with work and rest. If you have a chronic illness, for example, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a different relationship to rest than broadly healthy, able-bodied people do. You may have less energy to begin with fatigue as a key symptom in many chronic conditions. You might have heard people refer to themselves as spoonies, or talk about not having enough spoons to do something. This idea originated in Christine Miserandino's essay, The Spoon Theory. Miserandino, who has lupus, used spoons to explain the daily toll that her condition takes. While trying to explain her experience to a friend while they were in a diner, Miserandino grabbed a bunch of literal spoons and placed them in front of her friend. She said, "These spoons represent energy," and then asked her friend to go through her daily routine, with Miserandino taking away a spoon for each task. As she rattled off daily chores, or just fun things to do, I explained how each one would cost her a spoon. I broke down every task to show her how every little detail needs to be thought out. You cannot simply just throw clothes on when you're sick. I explained that I have to see what clothes I can physically put on. If my hands hurt that day, buttons are out of the question. If I have bruises that day, I need to wear long sleeves. And if I have a fever, I need a sweater to stay warm, and so on. When we got to the end of her pretend day, she said she was hungry. I summarised that she had to eat dinner, but she only had 1 spoon left. If she cooked, she wouldn't have enough energy to clean the pots. If she went out for dinner, she might be too tired to drive home safely. It's a reality that many people are intimately familiar with. Tasks take more time and more energy for you, giving less time to rest, but more rest time is needed than the average person to do a task in the first place. And then there are other symptoms that are difficulties on top. Pain, of course, can affect people's ability to rest, as well as dizziness or vertigo or heart palpitations. As Miss Arandino continued, I didn't even bother to add into this game that she was so nauseous that cooking was probably out of the question anyway, so she decided to make soup. It was easy. I then said it's only 7 p.m. You have the rest of the night, but maybe end up with 1 spoon so you can do something fun, or clean your apartment, or do chores, but you can't do it all. People with mobility issues face additional steps to even travel to the same events, workplaces, or shops as those without. Social media is full to the brim with first-hand testimonies of wheelchair users battling these systems, for example. Take this video from TikToker Zara Beth describing a horrible but not atypical transportation experience.
I started by driving 40 minutes to the station, only to realise that my tyres didn't fit, and when I got to my destination, assistants forgot me and I had to wait, and the lift was down. They ended up sending me back to the station that I'd just come from, but when I got to the platform, the staff who put me on the train told me that it actually wasn't accessible.
Oh my god. This is so annoying. I'm so tired.
What drives me crazy is that Zara has pre-planned her journey with these accessibility hurdles in mind, right? Has already taken time to try and make sure the journey goes well, but it doesn't matter because the lift didn't work and the TfL workers had inconsistent information and the transportation assistants literally forgot her. And these things are not considered important enough to prioritise. If someone without mobility issues wanted to make the same journey, it would take them 1 train. It took Zara 6. Zara's time is just as valuable, but it isn't treated that way. By the time this other hypothetical traveller arrives home to a restful space, Zara is still on a platform dealing with panic and uncertainty. And then, on that hypothetical traveller's train ride, they've gotten to zone out and listen to music and pretend they're in a romantic comedy while staring out the window. But Zara is stressed and anxious and needs to process conflicting and unclear information. A survey from this year found that a mobility physical disability leads an otherwise identical person to engage in over 10% fewer activities on a typical day. I'm just honestly surprised that number isn't higher. In a 2023 blog post titled "Time Lost to Disability Management is a Health Inequality," Ali Carver argues that the amount of time lost by managing one's disability results specifically in isolation from society. Public inaccessibility and legal barriers isolate disabled people from their greater community. Therefore, disabled people often have to navigate the complicated coordination of their care without the support system that many non-disabled people enjoy. These time barriers also tend to disproportionately impact those with multiple marginalised identities, particularly people of colour and queer people, creating barriers to the kind of social rest and rest support that needs to be considered alongside, literal physical rest as well. To make matters worse, society often interprets the disabled community's lower productivity as inherent laziness. We've all heard someone, whether in person or online, in a viral clip of the world's worst podcast, complain about too many people collecting disability benefits. People who cannot work full-time or at all due to a disability face disbelief, scorn, and judgment from many. Much like poverty, people react to disability with a pseudoscientific callousness. In a personal essay, Jenny Livingston described her frustration with being perceived as lazy for not working. Strangers, upon learning that Livingston collects benefits, would comment that they were jealous of her full-time paid vacation. Livingston writes that, "Having a chronic illness does not prevent me from wanting to enjoy my life. I do like to go out and have fun. and I love sharing pictures of those moments, but those things do not mean that I am fine. For every picture that's posted, there are so many things that aren't made visible. The work it took to get there, the hours or days spent recovering, depending on the event, the treatments I needed before and immediately after going out, the coughing, the exhaustion, the accommodations my friends and family had to make in order to include me in those things. My ability to occasionally go out and do fun things does not equate to the ability to work a full-time job. We can see this kind of false hierarchy of needs imposed on Livingston, where work is the first priority and leisure is the second. If there were any spoons, any energy, any life in you, then you better use it to work before anything else, these attitudes seem to suggest. But a life without leisure and rest is far more dangerous than a life without work. I just want to take a minute for an ad to thank today's sponsor, Displate. Returning sponsor, in fact. They create premium metal posters with a huge range of designs, including a bunch of official licensed fandom collections from Arcane to Lord of the Rings to D&D. Like, I'm not saying that my audience are a bunch of nerds, but I hope you are. I am trying to do interior design in my new living room, which is why I picked illustrated, like nature-based pieces. I just think birds are neat, you know? Whether you prefer pop culture icons or personalised art styles, there is going to be a display designed to suit your space, with work from over 40,000 independent artists and the freedom to upload your own personal designs too. And you might be thinking, Rowan, that's all well and good, but I can't risk my security deposit. My landlord already hates me. Well, worry not. These prints come with a tool-free magnet mounting system, which is safe for your walls and super quick to put up. No holes in the wall needed. Plus, it means that you can swap out designs anytime you want using the same magnet. These bad boys come in 3 different types of finish: matte, gloss, and texture, which include different texture details and 3D design elements. So yeah, could be a great option for a Christmas gift for a fandom obsessive in your life, helped along by fast shipping and custom designs for even the most niche of obsessions. Use my code ROWAN or the link in the description to get all of these discounts. Okay, back to the video. Part 3. When does rest become laziness? I think it's important here to stare headlong into the sinful elephant in the room when it comes to rest, that is, laziness. An accusation thrown at many people who don't or can't measure up to the acceptable level of work and productivity. I think this definition from the Restlessness Compendium is such a good one. Laziness, whether in the sense of an allergy to effort, a morally questionable reluctance to pull your weight when there is work to be done, a fondness for shortcuts, or a well-developed appetite for the pleasures of idleness, has probably always been with us. I like it so much because I think Greenie taps into the various cultural attitudes to laziness that mean that its definition is almost impossible without some kind of moral judgment creeping in. Laziness is not a neutral word or state of being. It conjures a kind of fear that had me so on edge at first in Berlin. I remember babysitting as a teenager, hearing the keys in the door as the kids' parents returned, and being like shot through with this edge of panic, this feeling that I should at least look like I'm doing something. And they left a few hours earlier telling me to like eat whatever was in the cupboards and watch some TV. But I still felt like being observed doing nothing, being lazy, especially I realise now by an employer. Even back then, it felt wrong. One of the most influential modern critics of this moralization is Dr. Devon Price, the author of Laziness Does Not Exist, who writes about what they call the laziness lie. The laziness lie has 3 main tenets. 1, your worth is your productivity. 2, you cannot trust your own feelings and limits. And 3, there is always more you could be doing. I think most of us can relate to these 3 points as ideas that we've brushed up against in our experiences of work and wider life. Price explains the dangerous, even deadly consequences of believing this lie, ignoring our limits and pushing through for the sake of avoiding the label of lazy, even if the person bestowing the label is ourselves. The laziness lie romanticizes stories like these of hard-working men toiling away despite all the difficulties they faced. But I saw firsthand what my dad's life was like, and my grandfather's, often desperate, lonesome, and filled with pain. Hard work didn't buy either of them safety the way they dreamed it would. Both men were in horrible health all their lives, and both died in their 50s. At the centre of the book is this idea that behaviours that we see as laziness will in fact always have an important reason behind them. If laziness is a lack of motivation, of energy, of care, we should be questioning why that lack exists rather than damning it outright. Through the book we get a range of potential reasonings behind so-called laziness, from depression to procrastination to apathy. but crucially, a deeper digging into the reasons for those states of being too. The seemingly bad behaviours we tend to judge as laziness are really powerful signals that something in our lives needs to change. Now, this might be your body trying to tell you something about your health, energy levels, or current capacity. It might contain an underlying message about your true priorities. It might be a sign of an unjust system that expects you to care about putting effort into certain things without question. The book encourages exercises in empathy. Why might someone you perceive as lazy be unable or unwilling to put in the effort that you think is right? What issues, challenges, barriers, problems, or fears might be present? What would it mean to approach laziness with offers of aid instead? Now, there's an argument I think that people instinctively make when they hear about Price's work, that it seems too based in a world of niceness and optimism that isn't necessarily universal. Sure, some people might not be lazy, but you can't say no one is. One key example being gendered experiences of laziness, such as weaponized incompetence, that being the phenomenon of men feigning a lack of ability or skill in a household task so that their wife or girlfriend will pick up the slack. That surely is nothing but laziness. But I'd argue that the issue here still isn't laziness, not really. Much like the other examples, there is another layer of root causes here, but in this case it's things like disdain or contempt. These men aren't piling work on their partners because they are lazy, full stop. They're doing it as a learnt behaviour that is motivated and excused by a social entitlement. That is where the moral judgment could understandably come in. But behaviour we categorise as laziness in and of itself is not a moral failing, or even a bad thing necessarily. It feels similar in many ways to the ideas that I explored in my Politics of Ugliness video, where I questioned not just what we see as ugly, but why ugliness is seen as a bad thing in the first place. That initial definition of laziness at the start of this section included like a fondness for shortcuts. And it's in this example that we might reveal another layer of complexity to this laziness lie. Because a tech bro who programs an AI to do his work for him is held by many in high esteem, even though he technically fits that definition of laziness. Who is allowed to be lazy, whose behaviour is interpreted as laziness, is not a universally objective truth, right? Laziness is often a kind of political categorization that overlaps like a Venn diagram circle with these ideas that we spoke about earlier in the video around who is permitted to rest. Consider a chronically ill disabled person. They don't work for a living and instead survive on income from the welfare system within their country. They spend most of their time in bed or on the sofa. They order takeout rather than cooking. They spend a lot of time watching TV or playing video games or listening to audiobooks. They cancel plans quite frequently and turn down invitations a lot. If hard work is a moral virtue and laziness is a moral weakness, then a lot of people would say they are a bad person. Except they obviously aren't. At least not because of their physical capabilities and inability to work, right? But I don't even think it's just about the fact that we can understand why they spend a bunch of time in bed that makes this behaviour okay. I don't think we should need to justify rest in that way. Framing it that way, that behaviours like napping, watching TV, playing games are excusable in certain circumstances, is part of the problem because it implies that they need to be earned, and in the same way that rest needs to be earned. A chronically ill disabled person and someone at the height of physical and mental health both deserve rest. And this idea that it needs to be earned is part of the demonization of disabled people unable to work. The label of laziness being banded as a weapon by people who have bought into this work ethic so hard that instead of wanting to expand access to rest, they try and keep it from others. Because when capitalism treats our work as the same as our worth, it can seep into our own sense of self-worth, what we think about ourselves, what we deserve, and what we have to work to earn. And when we see someone getting what we earn without having gone through the same work, it can feel unjust, but instead of turning to question the system which has us guilty and desperate for rest, many instead turn anger onto the people within the system. The irony, of course, being that what looks like rest for many disabled and chronically ill people is anything but. True rest kept at bay by pain or fatigue, ordering food not for a fun treat, but a lack of ability to stand or move well enough to feed themselves. Activities they might want to do impossible to access, plans cancelled or flaked on due to exhausting flare-ups, not because they just don't give a shit, but also that even a well-meaning reassurance that you know they aren't lazy is still enforcing this idea that if they had a moment where they decided not to do something, not because of pain or fatigue or their disability, but just because, that would be something worthy of judgment. And that is an idea that we should also try and question. Part 4. What is a life without rest? Okay, so what are the consequences of a life without rest?
When we look at people being fatigued, the rest deficits all have different symptoms, and those different symptoms are specific to the type of rest they're needing. So let's say, for example, physical. Physical is probably the easiest one. You may have body aches and pains. You may notice that you have swelling in a place. And don't get me wrong, I think that it's important for everyone to have a general physical, make sure you don't have any underlying medical problems. But when the doctor comes back and says, I don't find anything wrong with you, and you're still tired. And so maybe it's mental rest where your brain doesn't turn off. So you lay down at night to go to sleep, but you're processing all of the day. You're thinking about your to-do list for tomorrow, or you're feeling as if you're in a constant brain fog. Maybe it's spiritual rest where you don't feel like you have any purpose. You don't really understand why you're here and what you're supposed to be doing. You might be busy doing a lot of work, but it doesn't have any meaning or satisfaction to you. Maybe it's emotional rest in that you have a lot of opportunities in your day where you're having to censor or hold on to your emotions. I call it professional emotional labor. Your professionalism may require that you don't say the first thing that pops into your mind. And so you're censoring those emotions, putting it all in your professional emotional backpack, but then the backpack gets heavy. Where do you have the release with that? Sensory, that one's self-explanatory. We live in a noisy, busy, graphic world. And so lots of sensory inputs. And creatively, we spend a lot of energy processing answers to questions, diagnosing things within our own lives, problem solving. And problem solving has a high level of sensory or creative rest pull. And so someone who's experiencing that may find that it's very difficult for them to be innovative. They can't think outside of the box. It's like if something's not black and white, they don't have the ability to extrapolate because that's a creative process.
There's the literal obvious ones. So, burnout, that's a phrase experience I'm sure many of us are very familiar with. The result of acute and chronic stress, health issues that come with being run down, conditions like long COVID, which are literally brought on and exacerbated by a lack of rest. At this extreme end, there's issues of literal sleep deprivation, which increase your risk of anything from anxiety and depression to heart disease and stroke. It disrupts your hormones, can hinder your ability to learn and problem solve. Ironically, it makes you less productive and less capable. Drowsy driving, while not as utilised for movie characters' tragic backstories as drunk driving is also extremely dangerous. We can see the issues of a lack of sleep in our own lives, right? Maybe in the yawns or dark circles of the people around us. But we can also see it in the growth of corporations capitalising on this trouble with sleep itself. Evidence of a collective lack of rest and sleep has already been seen and jumped on as an opportunity. Now, some of these are genuinely useful things. As someone who has a lot of sleep issues due to health conditions myself, like blackout curtains, relaxing audio, white noise machines, weird looking physio pillows, they're useful, but others align more with the rise of what has been called sleep capitalism. Fitness bracelets that give you a sleep score. I really want to do well in terms of sleep. I want to maintain my streak, one user wrote. And a $12,000 sleep enhancing mattress containing soothing seaweed and coconut husks. This is continued into products that work on us in our sleep. Skincare to wear while you slumber. Fast fashion pajamas to make you cute while you're passed out in the land of Nod. Aesthetics entangled with our lack of free time to create ways that we can consume while we are literally unconscious. Why do we feel the need to be doing something even when we sleep? On the surface, this focus on sleep might make it seem like we've moved away from the, sleep when you're dead hustle culture mindset where people openly celebrate sleeping 3 hours a night. But maybe we've only decided that sleep is important now because we found a way for it to be productive in its own way, celebrating sleep as something to be achieved in the right way, and which allows you to show up more engaged and productive at work. We can also see evidence of modern life as one that doesn't value rest for its own sake in the way that we're encouraged to socialise. Catch-ups over coffee in a cafe midway between your apartments, which you had to squish into a packed calendar. Viral videos of expensive themed dinners curated and captured online. I was just about this point of the script when my co-writer Isabel messaged to tell me that the iconic Mina Lee had dropped a video about productivity and leisure, and I, as someone who watches this channel may know, deliberately don't watch video essays about topics that I might talk about on this channel, so I don't get consumed with self-doubt, obviously. But Isabel informs me that Mina very thoroughly articulates how leisure and time is being corrupted by the commodification of hobbies, essentially turning your leisure activities like reading and running into activities that generate money, attention, and validation. So if you're interested in that side of the discussion, I'll leave it to Mina, check out that video next. To me, this commodification of hobbies strongly overlaps with the commodification of friendship. The idea that money is the same as connection and care. That spending money is a sign of true friendship, in a similar way to it being a sign of proper engagement with an interest or hobby. Just look at the rise of these big hen-dos or bachelorette parties. These traditionally were a one-night affair where you'd gather your friends and go dancing. Now it's a heavily scheduled weekend trip with coordinated outfits. The wedding website The Knot reports that 37% of attendees of both bachelor and bachelorette parties spend over $1,000 on the event, with 39% of male attendees and 34% of female attendees spending in the 4 digits. Crazy, that's literally crazy. And as these events get more expensive, they seem to be getting worse for the participants. One study found that as high as 48% of people hope that they don't get asked to be in the wedding party due to the costs. As a great philosopher once said, sometimes things that are expensive are worse. Now, to be clear, I don't think that rising social costs represent some kind of moral failing of this generation. Like, we are capable of profoundly beautiful friendships and relationships, of course. But I think it's clear that social expectations, which have always been connected to seeing the lives of others around us, might become more complicated with those around us include everyone we might come across on the internet. An essay written during 2011 in the early days of social media argues, I don't mean that new digital technologies convert friends into objects. This would be a simplistic reading of social media. I argue rather that they transform our human desire for connections into a commercial activity. While people reveal themselves in the pursuit of interpersonal links, data firms mine all this personal information for profit. What a diabolically clever strategy. The new social media then transforms our need for human bonds into an opportunity for financial gain. You know that protest sign, capitalism only finds value in a forest after it's been cut down? Well, capitalism only finds value in a friendship after it's been turned into something that we can post. And the more that this curation and commodification of friendship, gatherings and hobbies and interests is encouraged, the more restful it becomes. What were once sources of much needed rest become enmeshed with productivity and consumer culture. Part 5. So, what would incorporating rest into my life actually look like? While researching for this video and coming up with what I wanted to talk about, I realised that there are 3 key areas that need to be addressed for most people to truly connect with this idea of rest. 1, place, 2, possibility, and 3, permission. So first, the place of rest, or the physical boundaries and practical considerations involved in finding rest itself. To be able to rest, you need to find a place to do it, a place that is itself restful. Qualities of a restful place might be accessibility, privacy, and sensory calmness. Some strategies of rest actively require this type of space. Others mean it would be just quite useful, like the physical progressive relaxation technique, for example. You might be familiar already with the conversations going on around the lack of third spaces, literally meaning spaces outside of home and work. But I think specifically the issue is a lack of free to access third spaces, which give a place to simply be as opposed to a commercial space designed for doing something. Spaces that you can access without needing to pay for anything to remain there, where you can rest, talk with friends, listen to music, and no one will throw you out for being there. Libraries are examples of third spaces that can fulfill part of this. They're free to enter and you can stay all day, but you can't talk in most of them, and many close early or aren't open at all on Sundays, making them pretty inaccessible to those with 9 to 5 work hours. These pitfalls, in the case of most libraries, weren't created on purpose, but we can see examples of deliberate space hostility in many potential places of rest. Anti-homelessness decisions informing everything from public parks to bus stops in what is known as hostile architecture, ways that public spaces are made specifically uncomfortable to rest in for, any of us. And it isn't just the physical aspects of a space. The legality of rest in public is also an issue. The concept of loitering, which puts the act of simply existing in public spaces for too long under the jurisdiction of criminality. Well, that's an obvious example of it, right? In many spaces, all that's needed for a police force to engage with loiterers and force them to keep moving is a suspicion about that person or group, It's a statement about who can exist and rest in public spaces without being demonized or even criminalized for it. The racialized, anti-black ideas of who counts as suspicious is sadly unsurprising in this regard. Loitering has long been connected to ideas of who does and doesn't belong. The ugly laws I talked about in a previous video being another obvious example from history. Activists and creatives around the world have utilized this connection between place and rest in their work. Take the immersive piece Black Power Naps, or Siestas Negras, a performance installation which offers rest as a form of reparation inspired by the sleep gap, research which suggests that people of colour in America average less sleep than their white counterparts, particularly Black Americans. The installation invites visitors to lounge on a variety of embellished beds, replete with gauzy canopies, serene lighting, therapeutic sound vibrations, and other restorative props, as a way to reclaim laziness and idleness as power for those historically deprived of it. At the head of the space is a tongue-in-cheek warning proclaiming, "If you see a black person sleeping, don't call the police." The artists themselves are interested in this intersectional aspect of a lack of access to places of rest. In Spain, the siesta is great, but it's sustained by labour, which is often done by femmes, which is never seen as labour, says Sosa. It's a very accurate citizen gap in that so-called siesta. And then issues of place and rest have been a source of gendered commentary by other organisers too. The annual event Meet the Sleep, where women across India engage in public sleep-in protests, aims to highlight the fears of harassment and even assault that many women have just existing in public spheres. The issue of sleep and protest has a long history too, with a lack of access to public spaces to rest and sleep running counter to attempts at long-term protests over many days. After all, how can you sustain a multi-day protest if you're not permitted to sleep in public? The Vietnam Veterans Against War group in the early 70s fought the courts for the right to sleep on the National Mall as part of their week-long demonstration. When the courts denied their petition, veterans decided to break the law by sleeping anyway. Or, in a moment of bitter irony, in 1982, the MPS granted a permit to the Community for Creative Nonviolence, allowing for the erection of 2 tent cities as part of a protest on the mall that would demonstrate the plight of the homeless. They refused, however, to grant protesters permission to sleep in these symbolic tents. While in Berlin, I attended the Festival of Future Nows, where artists were invited to imagine visions of the future. Some were tech-heavy, some participatory, some dystopian. But one that stood out to me was the work of the Temporary Landing Zone project. A platform raised a foot above the ground was covered in cushions, blankets and pillows, and on it, artists and members of the public were freely invited to come and rest. I arrived just in time for a napping lecture, where one of the members of the project talked about some of the ideas behind it, and was then invited to nap for 10 minutes with them. It was so at odds with the rest of the space. Hundreds of pieces of art packed into one large exhibition hall, the voices of hundreds of people milling around, and so clearly was this piece relevant to the video that I was researching. I reached out afterwards to ask them more about the project. TLZ is a Creative Europe funded project that aims to explore rest and translating into plainer language. More widely, it will try to connect to crypt studies, accessibility, and history of crypt studies, especially those around neurodiversity. Rest and accessibility are intimately connected within their work, rest being a necessary component of accessible spaces and processes, especially when it comes to neurodivergent participants. Their interest in creating plain language, easy to understand resources is itself a commitment to preserving mental rest for anyone who wishes to engage in their work. The project has dual goals: making physical spaces accessible as an attack on capitalism and productivity, and making communication accessible, rethinking how the project is organised, communicated, and diffused through text and face-to-face interaction. The installation in Berlin also invited audiences to write their own endings to the phrase "rest is," leaving the cards around the outside of the nest-like space at the centre so others could read what they'd written. At the side were books relating to their work, but also accessible accessibility guides, plain language explainers, and other interactive objects that gave people a choice of how to engage. I asked them about the connections that they saw between neurodivergence and rest, as it's such a key focus in their work. The connections are multiple. One can think first that neurodivergents need to rest more than others because of sensory overload or cognitive overload. Yet it is interesting to see that all life forms are exposed to sensory and cognitive overexcitements, not in all proportions and abilities to regulate, obviously. And neurodivergent activists have been developing techniques of regulation and access practices, resting but also stimming, stealth stimulation, nonverbal communications, that could be useful at some point in a world that tends to be less and less cognitively livable. I don't think it's a coincidence that marginalised artists, activists, architects and thinkers are pioneering these ideas around rest. As the TLZ team explained, those who have been denied safe and meaningful rest have often had to create their own spaces and methods of finding it outside of mainstream ideas and ideals. So, suppose we found the perfect place to rest. What's next? Well, the second consideration is possibility. That is finding the space in our lives to rest, finding the time to do it, the energy to demand it, and the support to sustain it. I'm aware that there is an irony that in order to find the energy and foster the community, we might need to be able to rest enough to counter the cultural exhaustion that persuades us that this is just how it is. And that can be a tricky circle to break free of. At the start of the video, I kind of compared the overworked exhaustion that many of us feel about our lives to a hamster wheel. But that isn't exactly right, because hamster wheels in reality are a small part of a larger space, where there's ample food and soft places to rest and sawdust to burrow in. And crucially, the spinning of the hamster wheel is started by the hamster itself. The hamster is free to jump on and off at will. It doesn't have a spin quota to meet. It doesn't have a voice in the back of its head asking why it isn't spinning hard enough. It doesn't jump back in with the wheel already whizzing beneath its feet. Our wheel is, in fact, a lot harder to escape from.
I feel like most people who struggle with rest, one of the things I found that's really helpful for them is an analogy that I give based around the bee. I think a lot of us think of the term busy as a bee. You know, it's kind of like this pride thing, how much work bees get done and how busy they are, and they can make the honey and all of it. But if we think about our lives and our own productivity in the same way, we're doing all the things, we're producing, but the life of the bee is so sad. It's producing something so sweet and so beautiful and that's so valuable, but it never actually stops long enough to taste the sweetness for itself. And is that really a successful life? And that's where a lot of us are living. So we're busy, we're producing. Other people are getting our brilliance and they're getting the beauty of what we produce. And then we feel empty. We feel unsatisfied because we actually don't create moments, have opportunities to experience the sweetness of the life we've produced. And so I think that's really at the core of what rest is about. It's success that doesn't just look successful, but feels successful, where you actually can enjoy the things that you're producing.
One of the most interesting parts of the research for this video was the world of rest-based activism. Not just people fighting for rest so that they might be capable of more traditional methods of activism, but sleep and rest as activism in and of itself, a means to its own end. The article, What Comes Before Woke, on the history of sleep as a form of protest by Fanny Noodleman, it draws together the language of sleep and resistance. Think not just about the term woke, but the idioms and phrases like I won't rest until, or I have a dream that. In popular movements for peace and justice, sleep has signified both a death-dealing ignorance and the utopian promise of a regenerated society. We cannot wake until we have slept. And through this lens, we might think about the wider impact of prioritising rest and what it has the potential to change on a societal level. At the temporary landing zone installation, I filled in my own end to the sentence, rest is. I wrote mine based on my initial instincts in that moment, what I felt, especially after 2 weeks at this residency where I was struggling so hard to find a rest state. I wrote, rest is anti-capitalist, and so we have forgotten how to do it. When I decided on this topic for the video and began my research, a few names kept coming up again and again. People who had done work in this area, sometimes scholarly, sometimes activism. One of those names was Dr Devon Price, who we've already talked about, but the other central figure is Trisha Hersey, creator of the Nap Ministry. Now, the way that my video scripting process goes normally is that after I've identified a topic I think will be interesting to research for a video, me and my co-writer or researcher will have a call where we talk about what I see as the scope of the idea, the associations I'm thinking of, arguments I might want to make, connections that need to be teased apart. ideas of different sections and key themes. So for this video, I talked about like this big theoretical capitalism link, this idea of modern culture seemingly being incompatible with real rest in many ways, but also smaller thoughts, like the fact that so many people have their best ideas in the shower, for example. Like, it doesn't feel like a coincidence when we realize that being under the deluge of water with no urgent task to occupy our brain is kind of a place of forced rest in a way, which then leads to the possibilities of rest as an exploratory, imaginative space. And so when I then read Tricia Hersey's book Rest is Resistance while scripting this video, I was struck by how closely everything she was saying aligned with what we'd already written down instinctually in this brainstorm. And that isn't to say that her book is like obvious or uninspired, it's the very opposite. Hersey has crystallized in her writing and her wider work a practical foundation for such a depressingly universal experience that I think everyone could read it and say, she's saying exactly what I've been thinking. Or perhaps more likely, she's uncovered for me something that I wasn't even allowing myself to think. Towards the start of the book, she outlines the 4 tenets of the Nap Ministry. 1, rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. 2, our bodies are a site of liberation. 3, naps provide a portal to imagine, invent, and heal. 4, our dream space has been stolen and we want it back. We will reclaim it via rest. Her mantra that rest is resistance is very specific in what it is resistant to. To center rest, naps, sleep, slowing down, and leisure in a capitalist, white supremacist, ableist, patriarchal world is to live as an outlier. It's not just about naps as individual moments of rest, but what Hersey describes as a kind of deprogramming. Fundamentally, her vision is one of rest as an ongoing, all-encompassing process of self, rather than a short-lived medicine to be administered when the disease of grind culture becomes too much in the moment. It exists in the long-standing Black liberation tradition of politics of refusal, maroonage, and outlier connection. There is massive knowledge and wisdom lying dormant in our exhausted and weary bodies and hearts. You need time to rest in order to be able to resist, because it's only in a state like daydreaming that you can do the work of imagining differences and futures to work towards. But within the world that we currently live in, rest isn't possible alone. Community support is a key ingredient. Think about all the small moments of action which might be alleviated by a tight-knit community, errands and chores which might be shared with others, for example, or physical objects and tools needed which take time and energy to purchase, including time spent working to afford them in the first place, or freely given offers of help that allow for physical or mental rest for one person and spiritual or creative rest for another. There's a side effect of this being that there's an increased need to communicate wants, needs, boundaries, and health with those around you. It becomes an act of community building in and of itself. Rather than holding back on talking about these weaknesses, they're a neutral part of the way that you socialize, letting people know the times in your menstrual cycle that you might need extra help, or the time of year that your energy fades more easily. You might start a community resource group, a spreadsheet or chat to be shared where you're able to list the tools and resources or skills or anything else that could be of help. Making one batch of curry or chili is kind of the same as making 4 or 5 in many ways. What happens if you only have to take the time and energy to cook dinner once a week, picking up the rest from local friends who also made enough portions for all of you? Especially for single people who often pick up the household work alone, the ability to buy food in bulk and not end up with wastage and still be able to eat varied meals is near impossible alone. The types of hustle culture side jobs on top of normal work become less necessary as the need to pay to buy whatever you need is lessened because you're able to access those goods, tools, and products from other people in your community. You might be able to offer anything from a toolkit to cooking utensils for people to borrow when needed. You can offer old baby clothes to new parents, or to help with doctor's appointments, or any number of things that take into account circumstances that might suck rest away from someone in particular. You can also conceive of socializing itself as an opportunity for rest. Meeting up with friends doesn't have to be a get up and go activity every time that might leave you happy but also exhausted. You could meet within one of the restful spaces in your life, read together, nap in each other's company, share the load on chores. Where many how to rest books and guides are focused on the benefit purely to the self, the ways that rest will make you happier and you more productive. Writers like Octavia Rahim or Tricia Hersey acknowledge the wider benefits and connections which make this kind of rest possible. Barter and participate in mutual aid. Make community care your biggest goal. All of these examples are ways to claw back rest within our current lives. But what might a more restful life look like if we were to reform the wider context that we live in? So long as people need to work to earn money to pay for survival itself, rest will be a political matter. Some people, of course, don't need to work. And I'm not talking about those with access to benefits, which barely replace a livable income, but rather those with inherited wealth. This reality, that most of us earn our survival through work, mostly for profit-making companies whose main benefactors are those with the most wealth, is so ingrained that to suggest imagining a world where employed work is not necessary for food and shelter seems impossible for many. But there are models that exist under the belief that simply being a human being should give you the right to these basic needs. Take universal basic income, for example. UBI is a set amount of cash, a new kind of minimum wage almost, given to every person, without care for their work status or income level. A wage just for being a person deserving of a comfortable life in a world that has more than enough wealth and resources to go around. Similarly, a guaranteed minimum income is a similar idea that tops up an income to a base level that's judged as enough to cover the necessities. The idea is not just about letting people live with necessities only. As work is still a part of this model, people are free to decide to take on positions to earn more money if they choose, but they don't rely on it for the basics, which supporters argue frees people from desperate jobs and dire circumstances. Instead, it creates an opportunity for anyone to pursue their passions and interests regardless of if it would pay a livable wage or not. Although no country has fully implemented UBI systems entirely, there are examples of the practice that we might be familiar with. Many countries give a form of universal child benefit payment, where regardless of income or work status of the parents, they receive a payment to help with the needs of their children when they're born. Even a partial basic income, that is a payment that isn't a full wage but is still given regardless of work or income, can have a profound effect. I essentially got a version of this kind of payment at 21. I gained a place on a master's course and was awarded a scholarship that meant that the course was free, and I received a payment to help towards living costs. But I was lucky enough to go to a university that was near family, and I stayed with my family during that year. And so the living cost payment, it wouldn't have been enough to cover like even shared rent in London. But because I didn't need rent money, I ended up having a cushion of money when I was looking for work and like housing afterwards. And it was one of the most profound things and impactful in the most incredible way that has ever happened to my mental health, but also my physical and financial circumstances. But even within the same capitalist system that we live in, where work for pay for survival is enforced, there are options for restful reform. When it comes to office jobs, the 4-day work week, for example, has been trialled extensively and has been justified not just because of, standards of human compassion, but also like the business benefits it seems to have as well. The UK's recent study of this, with results published back in 2023, required participating businesses to keep employees paid the same, but to guarantee a meaningful reduction in hours, either a 4-day work week or alternative based on the needs of their workers. So that also gave options for businesses that typically deal with shift work, like retail, that might not use the 5-day work week model to begin with. Of the 61 companies that participated, 56 are continuing with the 4-day work week, 92%, with 18 confirming the policy is a permanent change. Before and after data shows that 39% of employees were less stressed, and 71% have reduced levels of burnout at the end of the trial. Likewise, levels of anxiety, fatigue, and sleep issues decreased, while mental and physical health both improved. Many companies offer similar schemes, such as shorter days on Fridays in the summer, although many still require the hours to be made up elsewhere, regardless of how long it actually takes to do the work. But these ideas are honestly meaty enough for their entire own video essay, but suffice to say, alternative ideas of what work and rest look like are already here. Even if we have the place and possibility to rest, the final hurdle is perhaps the hardest to clear: getting permission, not from others, but from ourselves, to rest. the internal battle that is tied up with so many of us in guilt and vigilance and overstimulation.
I think there are a lot of people who have resistance around rest. I was one of them before this before this journey, rest journey that I've been on. I always felt like rest was the thing you do after the work was done, but the work's never all done. There's always something that you can do. And so my framework and my thoughts around rest had to be restructured, because right now, if your big picture is all about productivity, then rest is not going to be something you want to do. But if you look at sustainability, because producing is one thing, but actually being able to continue to produce for a long period of time, that's sustainability. And that's where a lot of us are struggling. And so if I look at rest as the thing that actually helps me continue to do the things I want to do, whether it be a career, whether it be something I'm passionate about, I have to think about sustainability, not just the productivity. You have a great work ethic. No problem putting the work in. What's your rest ethic? Because those two have to integrate together for you actually to be sustainable.
Because even in rest, the brain is still very much active. The brain shows a consistent pattern of activation, the default mode, during rest, has challenged scientific understandings from metabolic, cellular, and psychological perspectives about the ways in which a resting body might be accompanied by a distinctly restless brain and mind. Although this is seemingly a natural state of affairs for the human brain, this sense of restlessness can be exacerbated by external factors. Modern technology doesn't just make it possible to be constantly switched on, but in the case of social media activisms, it actively encourages it. It isn't a new observation that the pressures of communication, getting back to people, answering swiftly, run alongside the usage of emails and messaging apps and DMs. Sorry for the late response, or oh, I can't reply right now, I'm in a meeting, give me an hour. The expectation of constantly being available. Our leisure time seems most often taken up with consumption rather than action nowadays, but a consumption that doesn't give us a sense of rest. Scrolling through videos or online posts and forum threads, taking in information, emotions, news, ideas, that we don't give ourselves the space and time to dwell on deeply. There can be a kind of compulsiveness to the tapping between apps of consumption, looking for a distraction from the restlessness and boredom. Consuming art and entertainment can absolutely be a method of rest. As The Art of Rest explains, watching TV is often reported in research as a restful activity, something that people do to relax. People reported that watching TV was more relaxing than eating meals or even idling. It made them feel drowsy and passive, but also moderately cheerful. What more could you want after a hard day's work? People said that they liked spending time watching telly because they didn't feel obligated to do it. And they said the reason they found it enjoyable was that there was virtually nothing at stake. All this sounds like a perfect definition of rest. However, I would question their dismissal of the way that modern TV watching differs from the traditional idea of a relaxing hour with the family all in one room engaging with a specific show. More often than not, watching TV now is one of multiple activities happening at the same time, whether it's scrolling on our phones or using the TV as background noise as we work. The author insists, splitting your attention between the TV and another activity is no 21st century phenomenon. Back in the 1981 study, people were found to be carrying out a second activity 67% of the time while they were watching TV. But the secondary activities during that time were more aligned with things like eating or during chores like ironing, things that engage different areas of our focus, allowing the mental focus to remain primarily on the film or TV show that you're watching, in a way that's a lot less possible than if you're attempting to read on your phone or even watch other videos at the same time. I think we're out of practice when it comes to real rest in many ways. We've internalized this call to productivity and reflect it back on ourselves, even in the privacy of our own minds. It's a kind of vicious circle. Even when we find the time to rest, time off work, a long weekend, a full holiday even, many of us struggle with doing nothing, because the often unconscious messaging remains. It's a kind of colonization of the mind that can only be shifted with a purposeful decapitalizing of our own self-perception. I saw this post online while scripting this video that I think kind of sums it up perfectly. Kill the shift manager in your brain. You are not wasting time. You are vibing. You are not being unproductive. You are literally chilling. Make a grilled cheese with cheddar cheese and slather a piece of the bread with some honey and maybe you'll relax. Price expands in their book the specific beliefs that the laziness lie can have us internalize. Do any of them resonate with you? Deep down, I am lazy and worthless. I must work incredibly hard all the time to overcome my inner laziness. My worth is earned through my productivity. Work is the center of life. Anyone who isn't accomplished and driven is immoral. While at the temporary landing zone installation in Berlin, I noticed that a lot of people hesitated to join in on the rest. I was one of only, I think, 2 people outside of the organisers who got onto the pillows and sat down and actually listened to the napping lecture. And I asked them afterwards why it was that they thought so many people had such a struggle with resting, even when invited to, actively within that space. One of the hypotheses would be internalized ableism. Resting in public spaces would mean to expose vulnerability, to show that we are not functional in the way capitalism expects us to be. In this situation, something like the fear of appearing as non-functional or disabled might play a role. I don't think it's a coincidence that almost every notable person writing and theorizing and advocating around this topic is from a historically marginalized group in some way. Particularly, a lot of them are Black women. These ideas about productivity and rest intersect with cultural beliefs to a compounding degree. Persons, communities, and bodies that are stereotypically considered lazy, whether due to prejudiced ideas around race, class, disability, or cultural background, for example, have this extra layer of internal shame that might appear on top of a more generalized one. The Temporary Landing Zone project explained that these ideas seep into even spaces that should be actively resisting them, artistic and creative spaces, activist spaces, and more. The project develops rest as a practice of resistance and attack against productivity. This involves more than just commodifying physical architecture of art spaces. It requires changing time organization, activity rhythms, and expectations around bodies and cognitive functioning. Even anti-productivity efforts become productive, and spaces fighting ableism can become ableist themselves. This productivity mindset diminishes our ability to invent new ways of creating and being together. Because remember the different types of rest from the start of the video? Very few of them are really about doing nothing. Most involve engaging intentionally in some way, a relaxing stimulation of your senses, an opportunity to think about a topic without expectation or deadlines, a mindful exercise to ground you in the moment, or even more active pursuits. Jogging in the park or dancing with friends, belting out karaoke can be a restful act for many people. This equating of rest with a lazy do-nothing waste of time is part of this productivity mindset issue, that if there isn't a quantifiable thing produced at the end, that the process is meaningless. But similarly, there's an issue with the equating of doing nothing at all with an inherently bad thing, a waste of time, instead of part of the process of becoming rested, a process that is crucially important to all of us.
Rest changes depending on your background, your socioeconomic status, where you live, the country you live in. All of those have some specific dynamics. When you're looking at the 7 types of rest, the restorative activities and restorative practices you choose are your choice, and their choices are based around what's accessible to you, your abilities, your provisions that are available at that time. A lot of the restorative practices require no money, nor do they require extensive periods of time, because most of us don't have extra hours in our 24 hours. So it's set up in such a way that you can choose and select based on what's available to you. And there are seasons of life when your rest needs are going to change. When you go through grief, if you're going through a divorce, if you get married, if you have kids, the kids leave home. There's certain seasons that are going to affect your rest needs also. So we have to stay in a level of fluidity with our rest needs, actually staying really attuned to what's going on, how we're using energy throughout the day, what's becoming depleted. Do we have a rest strategy in place for ourselves so that when we start feeling the depletion, we have some ideas of what types of restful activities are restorative for us? Did it pour something back in? Did it fill me back up in some way, or did it leave me depleted? Because that helps you to be able to determine activities that are work versus activities that are rest. It helps you start thinking about what type of work or rest am I using? What energy exchange is happening there?
So how then might we try and give ourselves and others around us permission to rest? Okay, well, first, you could try and put aside perfectionism. Begin to believe that it's okay to just do what you can in the moment, even if that is nothing. You could set limits with people and obligations. As the Landing Zone team told me, one of the reasons why we don't successfully rest is also because others usually expect us to stay awake, available, and cognitively productive. This is why sabotaging cognitive norms is also important in the project, to help people to be put to sleep in some way, to learn how to get more slowly into reading, communicating, and other cognitive tasks. You could share this kind of permission to rest with others, spreading this idea to them, inviting them to rest too. potentially through digital boundaries as simple as email auto replies, acknowledging cut-off times for answering emails, giving yourself perspective on the real meaning of urgent or emergency in your work. Is it really an emergency? Is it really that urgent? It might look like conversations with your community about how to support each other in rest, including talking about these internalized feelings. Depending on the way that you've chosen to avoid rest before, it might also look like something very specific to you. Embracing body neutrality, for example, could be a way of resting, resisting the push to move your body more than it can handle in pursuit of an aesthetic goal that you feel pressure to adhere to. This all might be so alien to you that maybe it starts with something as simple as going through those 7 types of rest and giving yourself a moment to think about what each might look like for you. Imagine yourself doing them. Slow your mind. Take them one at a time until you have a little menu of rest that you can come back to. Close your eyes. Breathe. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to help support me make videos like this one, please consider joining my Patreon. I actually vlogged, I realised I'm not beating the lack of rest allegations, but I vlogged my Berlin trip there. So there are some videos around the different ideas that I explored while I was there, kind of extra content as well as things I do every month, like recommendation lists. I send out postcards, there are care packages, all kinds of kind of perks that you can get for being a supporter. And if you have any thoughts about any of the topics that I covered in this video, please do put them in the comments. Me and the gang would love to see them. I feel like this is a topic that is depressing universal, so I imagine that everyone will have some really interesting experiences. Would love to read about them. And until I see you next time, bye.